Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez here, and in this video we're going to talk about research ideas and hypotheses. And this is geared for my experimental class, which is Psych 4371. This is going to cover information that somewhat comes from Morling's chapters 1 and 2. It also comes from another book that I didn't want to require you guys to have, but I will include chapters of that if I decide that you need to read it. But we're going to talk about research ideas and hypotheses. Excuse me, I am still getting over a little bit of a cold. If you've listened to my videos about the orientation of the class, you'll know that I really do not like having my face up on the video, or the video streamed inside the video. So I didn't do that, but I did include a little photograph so you can see who your instructor is and have an idea of what it looked like. That's down here. I am rocking one of my awesome homemade University of Houston glow-in-the-dark sweatshirts, but in any case, there you go. So this video is talking about research ideas and loosely talking into hypotheses. I included an image here of a bunch of light bulbs, and as you can see, there is one that is in color. And to me, this image sums up my life. I am an adult, middle-aged woman. I like to think of myself as being a teenager at heart. I do teach both at the university level and at the high school level. And as I go throughout any given day, I am liable to come up with 945 different ideas of things that I feel should be made into research projects. And there was quite a gap between my master's degree and then my further education that led to my doctorate. I kind of took a break and, did adulting for a few years. But when it came time to get my doctorate degree, I had to come up with an idea for a dissertation. And this is how I felt. I had 945 different ideas, but I only needed one good one in order to get my dissertation done. So I really liked this image when it came up with, when I was thinking about what it means to have research ideas and pick one for your life. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, how do you get started? How do you identify a topic area and a research question that you are going to like to do? Well, part of this class, you're going to need to write a research paper. And if you've taken 4370 at the University of Houston Clear Lake, you'll remember, especially if you've taken it with me, one of the components you had to do was a research proposal that was geared at a non-experimental method. Well, we're doing the same thing in this class, except it's going to be an experiment. So you're probably wondering, well, what's the difference? We'll get into that as we go down the road. But for now, especially this week, you're going to need to pick a topic area and a potential research question. I have listed those questions in Canvas, and I'll go over that in a separate video. But hopefully you'll look at that list and there'll be something there that piques your interest. Now, pretend like that wasn't the case. Pretend like you were a researcher. You were a professor at a university, and you're charged with doing some sort of research. Maybe you've got to start coming up with a topic area and an idea to do research in. How do you do that? How do professors do that? Well, let's talk about how that happens. So the first thing you've got to do as a researcher is find a research idea. And usually those ideas or those topic areas are areas that interest that person. They're going to interest you. If they don't, then you're probably in the wrong idea, the wrong class, the wrong emphasis area. Something's not right. One of the things that you can do to find a research idea is to look at things that interest you and then go back and look at the previous research that's already been done on that topic to help you develop a new idea or a question. So what are some sources that people might look at when they're doing this? First of all, your personal interest and your curiosities definitely play a role in that. Now, as an undergraduate, my interests and curiosities were quite different than they are now. I was very interested in sleep back then. I even worked in a sleep research laboratory. I worked in a behavioral neuroscience laboratory. They were great. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. I'm very grateful for the time that I spent there. But as an adult, it's probably not the area that I would choose now. If I could do what I wanted to do in life as a researcher, I would definitely be researching things that had more to do with K-12 education. And I'm still very interested in sleep, but I'm more interested in the different behaviors between people who are night owls versus morning people. And I'm also interested in how those particular personality traits, or those chronotypes, which is what we call those, how those chronotypes might correlate or have an effect on the things we do in life. Like, for example, is being a night owl or a morning person more or less likely to correlate with extramarital affairs or behaviors of that sort? So that's a personal interest and a curiosity. Another way people do it is casual observation. So people watch other people, they watch animals, and by doing that, they may end up coming up with their own research ideas. So another one that I have that's from casual observation is a lot of my students that I work in an alternative school. The students that I work with are usually sent there because they have violated some sort of discipline issue with our discipline system. And a lot of them are avid consumers of marijuana. They smoke pot. It's just a given. So I'm curious how that affects their sleep and how their sleep then affects their ability to pay attention in class. And then the third one down here is reports of others' observations. So this is kind of the same as the second one, but it's coming from a second source. Now, I threw a picture of my cat, Squeaky, in here. Squeaky is a rescue cat, and obviously, since she lives with me, I observe her frequently. And she has a tendency to kind of roll over and lay there with her feet up in the air. And I've often wondered why she does that. And in this particular picture, she kind of has a sleepy, dreamy look in her eyes, but she doesn't always have that sleepy, dreamy look. Sometimes she just looks like she's staring up at the ceiling. So that's an example of how an observation of a behavior might lead to a potential research question. Sometimes there are practical problems and questions out there that we need to look at in order to come up with a research question. So a couple of examples here. It says designing environments with humans in mind. So audio controls in your car to prevent you from driving in a distracted manner. So I'm old enough to remember when Bluetooth didn't exist and your cell phone was the size of a backpack, and we didn't have the need for Bluetooth integration in a car, and we do now. So that led into a whole nother area of research into distracted driving. And then there are also some general research categories. There are always situations where we're doing what's called applied research, where we have practical problems out there and we want to solve them. Right now in K-12 education, we're dealing with issues with devices. We had COVID. COVID required us to all shift our teaching to online or asynchronous. Now we're seeing some negative effects from that. And I'm speaking from the K-12 perspective. So there's a shift going back towards pen and paper. So that's a practical problem that we're trying to solve. And that's an example of applied research. And then sometimes we have just basic research that involves studies that are designed to just address a theoretical issue. So behavioral theories are things out there that we have to consider, because these are theories that explain a behavior, or they explain how certain environmental factors might be influencing that behavior. So a researcher may come along and design studies to test those theories. And then sometimes we have models, and a model is a culmination of different components that form a theory. So in the slideshow here, we have an example of mathematical models that have been developed to explain what's called delayed discounting. And delayed discounting is when you put a lower value on a reward if that reward is going to occur in the distant future. So in other words, maybe I offer a student 5 pieces of candy on Friday as opposed to 1 piece of candy today. So that's how that works together to come up with a model. You could design a research project or an experiment to compare how a student's behavior changes if I implemented a delayed discounting model. So now let's talk about how we're going to search the existing literature. So one of the things that you're going to be asked to do as part of your paper is you're going to write a mini literature review. So after you come up with your research question, you're going to find 5 or 6 different journal articles, and you're going to summarize those journal articles in order to write a really small literature review. And I included a picture here of partial screenshot of the database screen from the University of Houston's library, because that's where you're going to need to go to get peer-reviewed journal articles in order to do your assignments. So when we talk about the literature out there refers to all of the studies that have been published regarding a specific topic. So what you're doing when you're trying to do a literature review is you're trying to come up with what's been done before by all of the previous researchers in order to help guide your research to answering your research question, and at the same time, you're going to be contributing to the body of literature about your specific topic. So when I ask you to talk about your literature review, the goal of that literature review is to find some studies that are related to your research idea. Now, in the ideal world, you're not going to find a research article, a journal article, that's exactly what you are trying to propose to do. But in a class like this, it's okay if what you're proposing has already been done before. We don't expect you in this class to come up with a brand new idea. Okay? So a lot of people seem to feel a little bit overwhelmed when it comes to a literature review. It's not. It's, in this case, for this class, a very small one. But if you were going to write a dissertation or a thesis, you would spend a great deal of time, much more than just a week or two, coming up with the literature. In fact, in my dissertation class, or in my doctoral studies, we had a whole trimester where that was all we did was literature and look at this study and find these other studies and go pull these studies and read and summarize and repeat ad nauseum. But it's something that has to be done. It does sound daunting, but there's some strategies that we can use. We're going to talk about how we cross-reference things and how we use summaries to help it. So when you get ready to start doing your literature review, after you've come up with your potential question, you're going to go first and look at some background information. You're going to want to pull some journal articles. You might need to read a couple of chapters in a couple of books, but we don't expect you to know everything about a particular topic, especially at this level, okay? You're also not going to read everything. You're just going to need to read enough that you understand your chosen topic well. So once you understand that, then as you continue with your study and your research, your literature review, you're going to be able to narrow your scope from the very general, like sleep, all the way down to something very specific. I'm trying to not cause my screen recorder to stop. I have done that before and then kept going, and all of a sudden found myself in trouble. So another thing you need to make sure that you keep in mind when you're starting your literature review is to keep an open mind. You're going to start with a very general topic, and you're going to let your background reading lead you to a more specific one. Now, in this class, you're going to probably have a research question that is already pretty specific, so that might not be a practical idea here. But say you come across something in the research and it's a variation of the research question that you have chosen and you want to change. Well, just shoot me an email and we can talk about that. So as you're reading, you're going to want to think critically. You're going to want to ask yourself different questions, and you want to be flexible while you're doing your research. You're going to need to focus, which is why I've tried to help you guys with this class by giving you a list of research questions that'll kind of take the ambiguity out of it. If you pick one question and stick with that, it'll help your process a lot easier than it would have been if you had to come up with it on your own. And we're going to do all of this one step at a time so that you're not overwhelmed. Let's talk about the difference between primary and secondary sources. So a primary source is a first-hand report, and these are what we're going to focus on in our literature review. So they're first-hand reports, so it's a report of what another researcher has already done through their either non-experimental or experimental research. So they do their research and then they publish it, and they publish that research in an empirical journal. And a thesis would also, or a dissertation would also fall into this because it's considered to be firsthand reporting. Secondary sources are things we want to avoid. So these are reports where an author is talking about what someone else did, someone else's observations, someone else's research. And you'll find those sorts of things in textbooks, research report introductions, and then meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is when someone basically attempts to summarize all of the research that's been done about one particular topic or research question. So they take all the studies that are out there and they analyze them for consistency and robustness of results. And I'm not saying that these secondary sources don't have value. They absolutely do. But they're not what we want to focus on in our literature review for this class. So make sure you use those secondary sources cautiously. They're usually incomplete. They only report certain information because that's what their goal is. Their goal is to provide summaries. But they can also include biases from the author, whereas a primary source is usually not as biased, okay? In a secondary source, we're going to only pick the sources that we need for our particular goal. And then secondary sources can often be inaccurate. Think about the example, I believe that's in Morling, where she's talking about a news article from, say, a magazine or a newspaper that's reporting about a research study. So if you didn't go back and read the original research study, you're only relying on a second author who's writing about what's been done. So you want to make sure you've also sought out different authors, different perspectives, so that you get a whole picture of everything that's going on. Now, why do we have to do a literature search? Two reasons. First, you want to develop a general familiarity with the research topic that you are dealing with, and you want to make sure you understand what's been done before. And then also you want to look at research studies that serve to generate your research idea, okay? You are trying to find a set of research reports that are helping to define the current state of your research topic or your question. Because your goal as a researcher isn't to repeat everything that's been done before. It's to identify a gap that hasn't been done so that your study will help fill that gap in and provide new information for the topic of interest. Here's a nice little picture here that shows how new research grows out of old. So back at the beginning of a specific topic, we start with a trunk, right? And those are our historical studies that we might consider to be the foundation of a research area. One I can definitely think of off the top of my head that does not necessarily have to do with psychology was the Watson and Crick study that postulated the shape of DNA. So the double helix shape of DNA, so I don't know if you guys remember from your biology classes, but DNA is kind of shaped like this, and then it has these rungs in between there. So in my biology course at my other employment, I have my students go back read the original Watson and Hicks article. That would be an example of a historical study. Along the way, we've had lots of branching in biology, especially molecular biology, and it kind of makes this tree-like structure, and it brings us to today. Today, we're right here. This is the most recent research studies that are being done. And unfortunately, I'm not very familiar with what's being done right now when it comes to molecular biology, but I can point you to the original historical study by Watson and Crick showing you the structure of DNA is a double helix. So when you do your literature search, you are trying to take a really large idea and narrow it down to a specific research question. We want to find published information that supports and documents our research question. And one of the places you might want to look is recently published secondary sources. So this is where you go back and look at a textbook's chapter headings and subheadings. Might help you focus your search down a little bit more narrow. As you're going along, you want to take hint of subject words. You might have a notebook. You might make a list of terms that you come across. Those terms or subject words will help you later on when you're looking at study variables or participant characteristics. You also want to make sure you are keeping a list of the author's names, because if you start seeing a name repeat over and over again, then you've probably found somebody who is a leading researcher in that field. Now, where are you going to go to find all of this information? Well, luckily, you no longer have to go to the library and dig through a bunch of journals. You can sit online from the comfort of your home and browse online databases. These databases can have millions of publications. You can cross-reference them by different words or authors' names. Articles might have a brief summary. You might only focus on the abstract, or sometimes, hopefully, and for the ones you're going to need for this class, you're going to find some full texts. Now, where should you focus? For this class, you're probably going to focus on PsycInfo. PsycInfo is one of the databases from the American Psychological Association, and it has abstracts of journal articles, book chapters, books, dissertations, and it is one of the largest resources out there for peer-reviewed behavioral science and mental health literature. Now, PsycArticles is going to be the best place to go for full-text, peer-reviewed, scholarly, and scientific articles in psychology. This is where you're going to want to go in order to pull your research articles for your for this class and for 4370 if you take that one as well. So this is just a screenshot of part of the screen where I went to the library at UHCL and I went to databases, and I'm going to show you all this later on in a little bit, but you can scroll down and you can see there's Psych articles, there's Psych books, there's Psych Extra. Each one of those are different databases that are going to tell you different things. ERIC is another place that you can go. ERIC tends to focus on education resources. So this might be something that you would use if you were going to go into education. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I don't believe I have any education majors in here, but it exists and it does help. Medline with full text is another database, and it kind of overlaps with some of the mental health, but it also has articles about nursing and dentistry and the healthcare system in general. Another really good place to go. So this is a little thing you can go back and read about the 5 different databases that are important. There's PsycInfo. Told you about this one earlier. It's going to have journal articles, book chapters, books, and dissertations. It's really large, and it's a really great place to go. Psych Articles is also another one. ERIC, we've discussed that one as well. Y'all can go back in your notes and read more about this if you want. You could also look it up in Google. It's not a big deal. PubMed is the online search engine for Medline. And then we come to Google Scholar. Google Scholar is something that didn't exist when I was as an undergraduate. We didn't have this. But Google Scholar is a place to go that does create a list of search results using Google, but it doesn't always produce the things that you want. You have to be very careful. Google Scholar will pull in things from outside of APA. Whereas if you go into PsycInfo, you're only going to get things that are published in psychology journals. Be very careful when you use Google Scholar, because I have recently learned that there are some places out there that claim to be peer-reviewed journal article or journals, and they are not. And you've got to learn to discern between the two. The advantage of Google Scholar is that it's very vast. It's got a lot of topic areas. It uses an algorithm that prioritizes topics that are usually of interest. It's publicly accessible. You can easily navigate it to it. You can follow these instructions right here. Click articles. Click on the square with 3 horizontal lines, advanced search. But just be very careful with what you're doing when you're using it, because it can be very misleading when it comes to what you get. Now, one important thing you want to do is you want to filter out irrelevant material. Make sure you use the title as the first screening basis. Look at your abstract. The abstract is the small summary usually at the top of a printed journal that kind of summarizes what was done. You want to make sure that there's a full text version, especially for this class, because you don't want to have to go to the library and have to pull an article. If your article meets those criteria there and still looks relevant, you want to start reading it carefully, because sometimes it may look wonderful when it comes to the title, the abstract, etc., and then you start reading it and it's something not relevant to what you're doing. And then at the end, you're going to find all of the references that were used in that particular article, and that will help you expand your research and move on into other areas where you can find even more articles. So when is your search complete? Well, for this class, your search will be complete when you have 5 to 10 articles that will all help you write the introduction of your paper. Now, I don't expect you to have all 5 to 10 of those this week, but I do want you to come up with 5. But in the real world, you would end your search when you were comfortable that you had exhausted the knowledge about your topic area and you have found few recent research studies that are relevant to your interest. And a lot of people say, well, how many articles is enough? Well, the key is that you have enough to justify why your research is important. That's the bottom line. So, how do we find an idea for a research study using a published article? Let's talk about that for a few minutes. So, finding an idea for a research study can be difficult. You have a list in this class to choose from. We know that we need to go through and look at the previous research, but researchers themselves often look at the discussion section of the paper because that's usually where the author will say future research should focus on X, Y, and Z. Okay. Learning how to critically read those research articles is also important. So you need to understand the different parts of the journal article itself. So let's talk about a few of those things. What are you going to find in the introduction? You're going to find the literature review, and the questions you need to ask yourself are, is this review complete and up to date? Is everything in here relevant? Did they leave out anything? And then that introduction is also going to end with the research question at hand and the hypothesis. So you want to make sure that those things are stated clearly at the end of the introduction. And then you also want to look at their specific prediction from their hypothesis, and you don't want to find that other predictions can be made. You want them to have a very specific hypothesis and a very specific prediction. Next, you're going to look at the methods. The methods section tells you what was done in that research. Questions you might ask yourself is, did they use a large enough sample size? The people that they used or the participants, were they representative of the population that they're being considered? If they left out certain participants, was it justified? Had they included those participants, would the results have been different? And were there other alternative ways to define and measure the variables? And we're going to talk about that in a separate video, because variables and the definition and the operationalization of variables is very important. Under the methodology, you're also going to see the procedure. And in the procedure, that researcher should be telling you exactly what they did in order to carry out their research. So you need to ask yourself, was that valid? And could they have used different procedures? And right now, since we're starting out this class, you might not be able to answer those questions. And that's okay. But by the end of this class, I hope that you are able to critically think, well, should we have used something different here? Your results section is going to be where the researcher discusses the statistics that were used, what was significant, what was not significant, and then the effect size. They want to make sure that their statistics and the results either support the failing to reject the null or rejecting the null. And by the null, I mean the null hypothesis, and we'll talk more about that later. The conclusions that they come up with need to be justified, and they also need to consider other alternative explanations or conclusions that might have been drawn from their research. And then the discussion section is when they discuss the results. They're two separate places. One of them presents the statistics and all of the good stuff that goes with that, and then the discussion section is going to tell you more about what does this stuff mean? What could have been different? What could have messed this up? What could have skewed this? What are some other things we could look at in the future? All of those things are addressed in that discussion section. They also want to discuss the applications. Does this have any real-world value? How are we going to take this and make it into something that is valuable to the body of literature? We also want to talk about if someone else repeated this research, would they get the same results? Ideally, they should. And then we also want to talk to the limitations of the study. Could this have been different? And that leads you into the future, other areas that could be researched next, the generation of new ideas. And then these papers end with references, which is a list of all the items that are cited in the paper. So how do we use that research idea to come up with a hypothesis and to create a research study? Well, a good hypothesis has 4 components. It's logical, testable, refutable, and positive. So by logical, it means that it's the conclusion of a well-reasoned argument, right? So there's a body of literature out there about the topic. Based on the topic that we've seen, here's my hypothesis. There's a logical succession of those events. Testable means that I can take all of the variables, events, and individuals, I can define them, I can observe them, and I can repeat the test that I want to do and test that hypothesis in a specific way. Refutable means that it can be shown to be false, and another word for refutable is falsifiable. And then positive means it makes a positive statement about the existence of something. Now, all of these things are talking about a hypothesis in general. We're going to discuss hypothesis testing in a separate video, and hypothesis testing in the statistical sense is quite different from a good hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is not an educated guess. It's not a guess. It is logical. It's based on a series of things that have happened in the past. Now, in the research process, steps 3 and 4. 3 specifies how the variables are measured and defined, and 4 identifies the people that are in the study, and it describes how they're going to be selected, and it's going to provide for their ethical treatment. So research studies can be developed from the same hypothesis. I can change different things around with my population, but my hypothesis is going to need to be able to transfer from one situation to another. So I know this was a pretty quick thing here in a separate video, and in a minute I'm going to put on the tail end of this, I'm going to walk you through how to do a a preliminary search for some articles. But in this video we talked about primary and secondary sources, how to use online databases, some of the APA research articles, how they're structured, how we use articles to find new areas of interest, and what a hypothesis is. So it's pretty quick and dirty, but hopefully in the next couple of videos all of this will start to seem to make a lot more sense.